George Martin's faith in the Beatles ran deeper than almost anyone else's. He could see their ceiling, their reach, and the way they might reshape music entirely. Still, even his belief had boundaries, since not every Beatles track came across as flawless. In the beginning, some sounded incomplete, others chaotic, and a few he felt shouldn't be issued at all. Even so, those songs were released. In the process, they exposed something surprising, not only about the Beatles, but also about the man guiding them. Number 10, Don't Let Me Down, 1969.
Don't let me down.
By the start of 1969, the Beatles had begun to drift apart as a unit. They functioned less like a band and more like four individuals occasionally aligning. The Get Back sessions, later reshaped into Let It Be, felt strained, loose, and lacking direction. Cameras captured everything, tension surfaced, and the idea of returning to simplicity felt more theoretical than real. Amid that instability, John Lennon introduced Don't Let Me Down. The song wasn't refined, it lacked careful structure. It came through as something raw, a near plea tied closely to his bond with Yoko Ono. It showed vulnerability in a way Lennon rarely allowed. The words avoided metaphor, and the delivery didn't chase perfection, which became the central concern. To George Martin, this wasn't the standard for a Beatles record. He had always focused on polishing ideas into something unified and complete. Yet this track resisted that approach. It didn't feel resolved, it felt exposed. In the studio, performances varied. The band couldn't fully lock in. The energy existed, but it was fragile, as though it might collapse at any point, and at times it nearly did. In the end, the song was excluded from the Let It Be album and instead issued as a B-side to Get Back, not because it lacked power, but because it didn't align with the structure Martin valued. That tension is part of why it endures. Don't Let Me Down isn't polished, it's sincere. At a time when the Beatles were fracturing, that sincerity may have mattered more than refinement ever could.
But love me like she did.
Number 9. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, 1967. By 1967, the Beatles had moved beyond simply writing songs. They were crafting entire sonic worlds. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band wasn't meant as a loose set of tracks. It aimed to be immersive, conceptual, and unpredictable. Right at the heart of that transformation sat Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. From its opening line, the song steps away from reality. Tangerine trees and marmalade skies create a dreamlike space. The imagery feels fragmented and surreal, almost disconnected from traditional structure. The melody shifts unexpectedly, moving from gentle, childlike verses into a heavier chorus. That unpredictability raised concerns. For George Martin, whose instincts leaned toward clarity and balance, this level of abstraction was challenging. The song ignored conventional logic, both musically and lyrically. It risked drifting into something difficult to grasp. On top of that, speculation around the initials LSD added another layer of unease. Whether intentional or not, the perceived link to psychedelia made the track feel risky beyond its sound. Martin worked to anchor it. The Lowry organ, controlled transitions, and careful production gave it footing. Still, hesitation lingered, because Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds wasn't safe or straightforward. It didn't offer easy meaning. It required listeners to let go and follow something uncertain. At the time, the real question wasn't its quality, but whether it strayed too far from the Beatles' roots, something history would later resolve. Number 8. Across the Universe, 1968. Some songs don't seem unfinished, they feel unsettled. Across the Universe belonged in that category. When John Lennon first introduced it, the track already carried a rare stillness, almost spiritual in tone. The lyrics flowed with unusual clarity, repeating like a mantra instead of building toward a clear end. Rather than evolving, the song aimed to remain steady. George Martin, known for shaping and refining material, found this difficult to manage. The track resisted structure. Attempts to frame it felt like they disrupted something delicate. Early recordings never quite settled. The tempo wavered. Arrangements struggled to find balance. Added elements, backing vocals and effects, often complicated rather than clarified its essence. The issue wasn't a lack of beauty, it was the absence of a definitive version. For George Martin, that ambiguity was hard to accept. A Beatles track, in his view, needed to feel complete, both emotionally and technically. It needed resolution, and this one seemed to avoid arriving anywhere. In the end, the song was excluded from the Let It Be album and instead issued as a B-side to Get Back, not because it lacked power, but because it didn't align with the structure Martin valued. That tension is part of why it endures. Don't Let Me Down isn't polished, it's sincere. At a time when the Beatles were fracturing, that sincerity may have mattered more than refinement ever could. Yer Blues, 1968.
Yes, I'm lonely.
When Yer Blues finally came together, the Beatles had already gone far past imitation, or at least that's what everyone assumed. So when John Lennon entered the studio with something that echoed raw, traditional blues, the concern shifted from intention to direction. Captured in a tight side room at Abbey Road instead of the main space, Yer Blues was intentionally minimal. No grand production, no orchestral layers, just a confined, almost suffocating setup meant to seize something immediate. And it succeeded. But that rawness carried a price. You already know why.
To George Martin, this wasn't forward movement. It felt like scaling back. The Beatles had spent years stretching studio possibilities, exploring new textures, forms, and ideas, and now they seem to retreat. The sound feels rough. The mix is heavy. Lennon's vocal pushes forward in a way that feels cramped and uneasy. Even the lines, "Yes, I'm lonely, wanna die," come across sharply, resisting any sense of polish. There's no separation here, no refinement, only intensity. Martin understood blues. He respected its roots, its truth. But within the Beatles' world of constant innovation, this felt deliberately abrasive, not incomplete, but intentionally raw. And that's what made it challenging. Because Yer Blues wasn't aiming to be a classic Beatles track, it was reaching for something else. A statement, a reaction, maybe even a rejection. And for a producer used to elevating and expanding sound, this controlled roughness was harder to refine and even harder to fully accept. Number 6. Within You, Without You, 1967. By 1967, George Harrison had begun writing in a completely different language from the rest of the band, not just musically, but philosophically and structurally as well. Within You, Without You didn't just sound different, it came from an entirely separate place. Built on Indian classical traditions, it abandons nearly everything associated with a typical Beatles track. There's no standard rhythm section, no guitar-led bass, no familiar verse-chorus structure to guide the listener. Instead, it unfolds slowly and deliberately, almost meditatively. And that became the difficulty. It lingers after they're gone. It demands a different kind of listening. Even the lyrics shift away from the personal into something broader and more reflective. Ideas of ego, illusion, and unity replace the emotional directness audiences expected. It wasn't just a stylistic change, it was a full departure. And that shift carried risk, because Within You, Without You didn't meet listeners halfway. It required patience, attention, and openness to the unfamiliar. Martin supported the vision, carefully shaping the orchestration and blending Indian instruments with Western recording methods. Still, the hesitation made sense. This wasn't a song you could polish into a hit. It was something you either embraced or didn't. And within Sgt. Pepper, it became one of the album's most debated moments. Not because it failed, but because it refused to follow anything the Beatles had done before. Number 5. Penny Lane, 1967.
There is a barber showing photographs of
There is a bar showing photographs of. On the surface, Penny Lane feels effortless, bright, precise, almost perfectly formed. It sounds inevitable, as if it always existed, waiting to be recorded exactly that way. But reaching that point was far from easy. Paul McCartney had a crystal-clear vision. It wasn't just music, it was a place, a memory turned vivid, where every line painted a picture and every sound supported it. And that clarity created pressure. Because when a song feels complete in your mind, the studio becomes a chase. For George Martin, this meant guiding a production that required precision at every step. The arrangement was dense, layered, and highly specific. Instruments weren't added casually. Each had purpose, position, identity. Nothing could feel misplaced. The piccolo trumpet, now one of the song's defining features, wasn't an obvious addition. It needed careful balance, standing out without overpowering the rest. And that balance was delicate too. Too much and it felt overworked. Too little and it lost its charm. Martin later reflected that Penny Lane was one of those recordings where perfection kept shifting. Multiple takes, multiple mixes, each slightly different, none fully final. And that's where doubt crept in, not because the song lacked brilliance, but because its exactness was hard to lock in. In the end, Penny Lane became one of the Beatles' most iconic tracks, but behind that clarity was a process that never fully settled, even when it sounded complete. Number 4. Strawberry Fields Forever, 1967. Some songs don't just test the listener, they challenge the process itself. Strawberry Fields Forever was one of those. When John Lennon introduced it, it wasn't a finished piece, it arrived in fragments. 2 versions, 2 tempos, 2 entirely different moods, one soft and introspective, the other fuller and structured. And Lennon wanted both. That was the issue. For George Martin, this went beyond arrangement. It was technically impossible. The tapes existed in different keys and speeds. Traditionally, they couldn't be merged. But Lennon insisted, so Martin did something groundbreaking. He altered the tapes themselves, adjusting speed, pitch, and timing to fuse 2 incompatible recordings into one track. It worked, but just barely. Even then, it felt unstable. The shift within the song isn't obvious, but it's deeply felt. The foundation seems to move. What starts gently transforms into something heavier, more surreal, almost disorienting, and that was intentional. Because Strawberry Fields Forever doesn't aim for resolution, it reflects uncertainty. Lennon's voice hovers between clarity and confusion. Nothing is real, feels less like a lyric and more like a mindset. For Martin, the hesitation wasn't about quality, it was about control. This wasn't something you could fully shape, it resisted being contained.
It crossed lines in unexpected ways. It hovered between drafts, between concepts, between confidence and uncertainty. Still, that ambiguity is what made it matter. Because in trying to shape it, Martin didn't simply finish a Beatles track. He helped form something that felt impossible, yet existed anyway. Number 3. I Am the Walrus, 1967. By the end of 1967, John Lennon wasn't just composing songs, he was responding directly to how people were overanalyzing his words, breaking them apart for meaning, treating them like puzzles to solve. So he chose to reverse that idea. I Am the Walrus wasn't meant to be decoded. Instead, it was designed to disorient on purpose. The lyrics feel scattered, bizarre, almost challenging in their unpredictability. Semolina Pilchard climbing up the Eiffel Tower. Phrases that reject logic, built more for sound than sense. And that forced a new kind of challenge for George Martin. This wasn't only about arrangement, it was about containing disorder. The structure feels unstable. Sections move without warning. The orchestration, strings, choir, radio layers stacked together, turns the track into something closer to a collage than a song. And then comes the ending. A live BBC radio feed of King Lear drifting in unpredictably, not traditionally planned, just captured and kept. It succeeded, but it wasn't tightly controlled. And that absence of control was rare for a Beatles production. Martin usually brought clarity to complexity, but here, complexity was the goal. The confusion was intentional. The lack of closure was by design. This wasn't something you could polish into simplicity, because doing so would have destroyed it. And that's where the uncertainty remained, not in whether it worked, but in whether it could ever feel finished. Because I Am the Walrus doesn't settle, it overwhelms. And for a producer known for precision, that was something unfamiliar. Number 2. Revolution 9, 1968. By 1968, the question had shifted from whether the Beatles could break limits. It became how far they would actually go. Revolution 9 wasn't a song in any normal sense. No melody, no structure, no defined beginning or ending. Instead, it existed as a sound collage, fragments of tape loops, spoken passages, orchestral noise, and scattered audio woven into something intentionally unsettling. And it came largely from John Lennon. Inspired by avant-garde artists and experimental composers, Lennon aimed to move past pop music completely, not just stretch it, but leave it behind. For George Martin, this was unfamiliar ground. He had spent years shaping the Beatles' ideas into something unified, something audiences could grasp. But here, there was nothing traditional to shape. There was no core, only layers of disorder. Number 9, number 9. The repetition turns hypnotic, almost intrusive. Sounds emerge and vanish without warning. Voices overlap, fade and return. It feels less like hearing a track and more like entering someone else's thoughts. And that became the problem. Number 9, number 9, number 9. This wasn't approachable. It wasn't musical in the way people expected. It was boldly experimental. So Martin hesitated, not because he opposed experimentation, but because this moved beyond anything a Beatles record had been before. Including it on the White Album meant redefining what the band would release under its name, and that carried risk, because Revolution 9 didn't just test listeners, it questioned the identity of the Beatles itself, not just as a band, but as something people believed they understood. Number 1. Only a Northern Song, 1967. At first listen, it feels loose, uneven, slightly unbalanced, almost unfinished. Only a Northern Song lacks the precision of Sgt. Pepper. It doesn't carry the depth of Harrison's later work. If anything, it feels like a song that isn't trying hard to persuade you at all. And that was both the problem and the intention. When you're listening late at night, George Harrison wrote it out of frustration, not only with the band, but with the system around it, specifically Northern Songs, the publishing company controlling most of the Beatles' catalog. Lennon and McCartney held the majority. Harrison didn't, which meant even his own songs weren't fully his. So instead of masking that frustration, he put it front and center. The arrangement feels purposely unstable. Instruments drift slightly out of sync. The structure avoids clean resolution. It resembles a Beatles track, but one that refuses to fully align. For George Martin, this created tension, because his role had always been to bring order, to turn ideas into something clear and refined. But this song resisted that entirely. It wasn't aiming for polish, it was making a point. And that point was uneasy. And in that way, it becomes more than just a track George Martin hesitated over. It becomes a moment where the fractures within the Beatles, creative, financial, personal, are no longer hidden. They're embedded directly in the music. And this time, nothing in production could smooth them away.